Well, hello, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. And it's Wednesday. I usually do a Wednesday evening show, but I'm doing this on Wednesday morning, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time this morning because I have a date tonight to meet with our good friend Andy Craig. And Andy and I will have dinner down at the National Press Club, and I'll report back to you after we have our conversation. I haven't seen Andy in about 3 years, and he's a good friend as well as a great author. His book, Presidential Puppetry, should be on everybody's shelf because it shows how all the presidents have been puppets ever since George H.W. Bush. And he really does a number on a lot of people that we need to take down, like Romney and Obama. And it's interesting that I think of Andy as a real, Democrat, liberal supporter of the uh, the liberal side of politics. Certainly, he has a deep revulsion and hatred. I'd say is fair word for Donald Trump. A similar attitude that Doug Valentine has towards Donald Trump, and so for him to be coming out with some stuff that a book that really just nails a lot of the deep state candidates and the deep state puppets, presidential puppetry, a fine book. I read the whole book on my show, and that's one of the ones that YouTube took down uh, just because they are YouTube. We are YouTube. We do whatever we want. So I've been wondering for some time how to get any deeper into the paperclip story than just reading Annie Jacobson's book. Annie Jacobson's book is good, but a lot of us feel like it is a limited hangout. She's got permission to say some things, but some things perhaps not uh, allowed or not. Not. Don't say this. Don't say that. So I found this book by an author named Tom Bauer. It's called The Paperclip Conspiracy: The Hunt for the Nazi Scientists, and it's very interesting to me that it has on the front of it a replica of a Iron Cross, a German Nazi Iron Cross with red instead of black, and the colors then make it Knights Templar colors, the red cross in the white field. And is there a connection? Yeah, I think there is between the Knights Templar and Nazis, and Himmler can study Himmler for a while, you'll start seeing how he kind of wove this kooky Nazism out of ancient legends and etc. Kind of a mass psychosis formation, to use a common term from present day, and a very clever way to control a society by digging up the roots of old religions and conspiracies, putting them together and marketing them with the control of the media, and people started to buy it. We've talked about that yesterday with things like fundamental Christianity and the difficulty we have with this kind of Israeli supporting right wing Christians that have been uh, basically seeded with this idea that somehow it's necessary that there be a physical Jerusalem and that the Jews go there and that the Christians help them go there, which is what happened since World War II, right? And since they did that, then they're supposedly going to be able to convince these Jews to become Christians before the great Armageddon takes everyone down. Well, now, I've been very busy, so excuse me for putting this together a little bit haphazardly, but I wanted to get started on the book. And so I'm going to just start reading with the introduction. He also wrote a book on, this book is written 1987, published in Great Britain by Michael Joseph Limited. And introduction. And let's go ahead and start it. I think you'll get the flavor of the book by the introduction, and you'll hear the things that I think are going to be valuable by reading this book. Introduction. As the giant Saturn V rocket rose majestically through the morning sunlight from Cape Kennedy in July 1969, two groups of German scientists flushed with pride. Apollo 11's epic voyage carrying astronaut Neil Armstrong toward the moon was, they felt, their personal triumph. The first group, united and jubilant in the control center, was the famous World War II rocket team from Peenemünde, Germany, led by Wernher von Braun, inspired by the magnetic personality of the Prussian. Von Braun's team had designed and produced the world's largest rocket, realizing their childhood dreams and ennobling them as national heroes in their adopted country. The second group, scattered, relatively anonymous, but almost as important, was the team of aviation doctors, led by 71-year-old Dr. Hubertus Strughold, an arrogant but clever Westphalian who disliked flying. This pioneering medical team had, by 1945, already carried out the basic research behind the delicate equipment that cocooned Armstrong and other astronauts from the violent acceleration, the lack of oxygen, the unnatural temperature, the unusual noise, and the eerie weightlessness of outer space. For both groups of elated Germans, the astronauts' confident messages to mission control confirmed the supremacy of German science. During the cataclysmic life of the Third Reich, von Braun, Strughold, and 20,000 German scientists had revolutionized the weapons of warfare. 25 years later, the Americans were reaping the benefit of their former enemy's youthful genius. Understandably, however, neither von Braun nor Strughold willingly discussed the circumstances in which the scientific origins of their work had materialized. If pressed, both men would recite their abhorrence of Hitler's regime like automatons. Neither, however, would openly admit that his skills, which had suddenly thrust fame and fortune onto American astronauts, had been honed amid the calculated murder and brutal butchery of Nazi atrocities. Fortunately for both Germans, their involvement with those crimes had been smoothly and conspiratorially expunged after the war by sympathetic American army officers, anxious to employ them in the United States. Their recruitment after the war had followed interrogation by American officers. After selection, the chosen German scientists were identified simply with an ordinary paperclip on their personal file. Like so many other beneficiaries of the paperclip conspiracy, they would eventually become respectable American citizens, their wartime activities notwithstanding, because senior military officers determined that, in the national interest, quote unquote, American immigration laws and a president's directive should be willfully ignored. The fact that all four allies, the Americans, the British, the Russians, and the French, became involved in the frantic and at times ruthless competition for German scientists is particularly surprising when one realizes that the use of the Germans was simply not contemplated until as late as 1945. On the contrary, on the eve of peace, the notion of associating on equal terms with the men who had helped Hitler's regime perfect weapons to kill Allied citizens was totally unthinkable. Why did the sudden reversal coincide with the discovery of concentration camps and the exposure of the worst crimes of the Nazi regime? And how did those who orchestrated the hunt reconcile the fraught moral and practical issues? It remains a significant fact that at the very moment when thousands of determined Allied officers began the hunt for German scientists, only a tiny handful were charged to seek out the war criminals. The answer to this riddle starts in the pre-war years when European engineering students learned German as a second language so they could read the important scientific literature published by one of the world's industrial giants and its leading technical innovator. It was no coincidence that many of the scientists developing the American atomic bomb in Los Alamos had Teutonic names. Von Braun's rockets were the symbol of Germanic superiority. The substance was considerably broader in engineering, chemical processes, and industrial design. But before 1940, this was not appreciated by either the American or the British military. At the outbreak of war, complacent military chiefs and politicians in Washington and London misunderstood the nature of the conflict into which they had been cast. In Berlin, scientists and engineers were the welcome allies of politicians and military chiefs. But in London and Washington, the government, the civil service, and the military chiefs largely ignored or even disdained the purveyors of technical information. Allied officers, startled by Hitler's momentous conquests, only gradually stumbled to the realization that their Achilles heel was the technical inferiority of many of their guns, planes, tanks, and submarines. On the eve of Hitler's final defeat, Allied scientists had narrowed the lead and occasionally overtaken their enemy, but in crucial areas, Germany's superiority, even in the last year of the war, had actually increased. Acknowledgement of that reality bred a conviction, some would say a legend, of German scientific supremacy that was not far from the truth. Yet, the complacent belief in Allied and technical superiority, which had gripped so many in London and Washington until 1940, was automatically regenerated by the victory in 1945. Their reasoning was chanted with stunning naivete. The Allied success had irrevocably proven the Allies' technical superiority. Quote, "We won the war, so we clearly possessed better weapons," unquote. Throughout the research and writing of this book, that sentiment has been often repeated. Unreasonably, it ignores the final imbalance between the encircling Allied juggernaut and the isolated Third Reich. The proof of German technical prowess is overwhelmingly established in the hundreds of reports written by Allied investigators who did not shy from describing the Germans, quote, "astonishing achievement," unquote, and "superb invention," unquote. It is also established by the very survival of Germany during 4 years of total war, despite the prediction during the first 2 years of war by British intelligence that the German economy and German industry faced imminent and total collapse. The blockade on essential minerals, chemicals, and petroleum products, it was argued, would cripple weapons production. But the very opposite happened, because German scientists developed an astonishing range of substitutes that not only humiliatingly neutralized the Allied blockade, but heralded the dawn of a new scientific era. One absurd but nevertheless revealing example of German skills was the Allies' covert purchase in Switzerland during the war of large quantities of glass eyes manufactured in Germany for wounded Allied servicemen. German scientists had pioneered so many inventions that many Allied experts would complain that their plunder could do no more than scratch the surface. Since 1945, the genesis of weapons by all four Allies has been dominated by the inheritance of Germany's wartime inventions. Indeed, the Korean War can be viewed on the technical level as a trial of strength between two different teams of Germans, those hired by America and those hired by the Soviet Union. The aerial dogfights between Soviet MiG-15s and American F-86 Sabres, both designed by German engineers, dispelled for many their doubts about the expediency of plundering Germany's scientific expertise. As the war ended, Allied investigators plunged into the hectic race to find their German competitors, were in turn shocked, excited, and then bewildered as they began to appreciate their own technical ignorance. For them, a haphazard series of interrogations conducted in the turmoil of a distraught and defeated nation was tantalizing and frustrating. The obvious solution was to transport the German exports to America and Britain, following the example of the French and the Russians. The American haul, enthusiastically hailed as an Aladdin's cave, was worth alone, according to some American military estimates, quote, thousands of millions of dollars, unquote. I guess that's billions, right? But the moral cost was debatable. And here's the crux of the book right here, the moral cost. Although few would understand the full realities of power inside Hitler's Germany until the tons of captured documents and eyewitness accounts had been painstakingly sifted and analyzed, incriminating evidence that paperclip scientists had intimate connections with the leaders of Nazi society and those in charge of the concentration camps was available when they were selected and brought to the United States. The puzzle is why, when their own friends had died to liberate Europe from the fascist scourge, the investigators deliberately ignored and concealed such crimes in the interest of plunder. This book is not so much about the predicament of tormented officers and scientists grappling with a moral dilemma as about outright opportunism and Machiavellian deception and intrigue. Nevertheless, the question of whether the decisions taken were grossly immoral or courageously perceptive lies at the very heart of this previously unexplored conundrum. It is a saga of heroes becoming anti-heroes and of outraged moralists suffering vilification. At the center stand the American and British military establishments, which earned their country's unqualified gratitude for winning the war, but in peacetime were unwilling to forsake their autocratic imperiousness. On the sidelines are politicians, government officials, and industrialists, all pursuing conflicting interests. Exhausted by war, elated by victory, apprehensive about the future, officers and government officials were often confused, torn between loyalty to their principles and determination to achieve their goals. Whatever their emotions, an infallible record of their actions remains in recently released government files. Reconstructing this final chapter of World War II has not been easy, but sufficient evidence exists to unravel the skein of events and the taut web of personal dramas and feuds that lies behind them to judge the deeds and motives of the participants and apportion some measure of praise or blame. The unanswered question is still whether a hard-headed assessment of military advantage should have outweighed the claims of just retribution. 40 years after the war, some of the protagonists will condemn a later generation for passing judgment on decisions taken in the unimaginable circumstances of wartime and post-war Europe. To such critics, one can only reply that the record speaks for itself. 7 years ago, I wrote Pledge Betrayed, a book that explored why the Allies not only failed to capture and punish many of the Nazi war criminals, but restored seriously incriminated Nazis to influential positions of power in post-war Germany. This book, which is in many ways a sequel, investigates the dilemma that ambitious but inexperienced young officers confronted should the very ideals for which the war had been fought be betrayed for the temptation of future prizes. Establishing exactly why the solemn wartime pledges of Roosevelt and Churchill to bring the war criminals to justice remained largely unfulfilled, whereas the recruitment of scientists, many of whom had readily embraced Nazism, was so successful, poses another fascinating enigma. Why did the Western Allies, having devoted considerable effort to recovering Germany's colossal wartime plunder, stashed away in banks and other hiding places all over Europe, abandon their quest, consoling themselves that the German scientists were, as Eisenhower claimed, quote, the only reparations we are likely to get, unquote. Legally, none of the four allies had any difficulty in justifying their policy. While occupying most of continental Europe, German banks, industries, and individuals had without scruple plundered each nation of its mineral economic and artistic wealth, in total worth tens of billions of dollars. The Allies were originally determined to recover some of that booty, or its equivalent. Although their first plans were considered in London in 1940, 5 years later, after millions of lives had been sacrificed and billions of dollars spent to destroy Hitler's regime, neither Churchill nor Roosevelt had approved the master plan known as the, quote, safe haven program, unquote. All that existed were a few officials who, in true Sherlock Holmes fashion, planned to recover the German loot. Their problems were immense, and they were actively hindered by the military. Even the most cynical and war-hardened GI or British infantryman who had fought from the Normandy beaches to the death camps in Belsen and Dachau would not have believed that the old cliche, quote, to the victor belongs the spoils, would so abruptly and so flagrantly be turned on its head. Yet, during the first 5 post-war years, America and Britain pumped more than $4 billion in aid into their defeated adversary and squeezed out minimal amounts in return. Eisenhower's historic acceptance of Germany's unconditional surrender was still a very recent memory, when sages bitterly quipped that Germany might have lost the war but had obviously won the peace. Only one form of compensation remained: Eisenhower's contaminated, quote, intellectual reparations, unquote. Safe haven failed, and Paperclip succeeded, because a handful of military officers willed it to be so, and no one wielded the political strength to oppose them. And that is the conclusion of the introduction, and we can move on to chapter 1. But isn't it interesting that this author says it's the military, it's the Army in particular, that became uh, greedy for this technical information, these amazing Wunderwaffen, and so gave in and accepted the moral dilemma as, well, it works, so we're going to do it. It's really breathtaking. And as we get into the chapters, we'll see individuals and how they fall into that category. Imperial delusion. Nothing illustrates the blinkered conservatism of the American and British military chiefs of staff between the 2 world wars more poignantly than their constricted vision of the deployment of tanks in future battle and their contemptuous lack of interest in the details of tank design. For officers and gentlemen oblivious to the technical revolution about to change the face of warfare, the thickness and metallurgical composition of armor, the reliability of gearboxes, the design of shells, and the competence of the industrial workforce were all profoundly alien. Unlike government departments in Germany, the British War Office disdained any relationship with industry. Weapons research since 1918 had been exclusively conducted by Britain's Ordnance Board. In a non-committal manner, they had investigated and reported on the performance of German weapons during the previous war, but their comments had been filed, unheeded by the Army chiefs. Concomitantly, the chiefs never held an inquiry into the performance and failures of British weapons during that war. It was one of the misfortunes of the next generation that many of the weapons developments initiated during World War I had to be reinvented in World War II. Tanks were first used by the British and French in battles of the Somme and Cambrai during World War I, and despite limited numbers, spread terror among the entrenched German infantry. Yet after the war, in both Britain and America, tanks were treated as an interesting experiment rather than as harbingers of a revolution in military tactics. In both Washington and London, tanks remained the responsibility of cavalry generals, loath even to contemplate the idea that their traditional skills had been relegated to more historic interest. As late as 1936, the British Cavalry Training Manual unambiguously explained the Army Council's stubborn position, amusingly dividing the cavalry into mechanized and horsed sections. The manual explained, quote, mounted drill in armored cars is based on the same principles as that of cavalry. The principles of training in field operations given in cavalry training, Horst, are in general applicable to armored car regiments, unquote. 1 year after the manual's publication, in August 1937, Hitler invited Sir Cyril Deverell, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, together with a large party of senior British military staff, to watch combined Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht exercises in Thüringen, involving 150,000 highly disciplined troops and parachutists, more than 1,000 tanks and anti-tank vehicles, and seemingly endless waves of dive bombers. They witnessed the massive maneuvers in the company of Hitler and Mussolini, but the display did not have the effect the dictators intended. Reflecting the corseted conservatism that permeated British military strategy, on his return, Deverell proudly reported, quote, "They look upon us as the authority on the use of tanks," unquote. It was an absurd statement, especially since Deverell had expressly forbidden Britain's leading tank expert, Percy Hobart, to teach student officers any tactics of tank warfare that offended against the sacrosanct cavalry and infantry manuals. Any doubts Deverell might have had were promptly laid to rest by reassurances that Hobart's new Matilda tank would match all the Germans' anticipated developments. Although a succession of reports from British military attachés in Berlin had already stated the contrary. Deverell was unshakably convinced that, since Britain had been victorious in 1918, there was nothing to be learned from her defeated adversaries. Inbred imperial attitudes completely anesthetized him to the dramatic changes in military tactics that the German chiefs of staff were planning and implementing. On Adolf Hitler's first anniversary as Chancellor of the Third Reich in 1934, Colonel Andrew Thorne, the British military attaché in Berlin, graphically described in the annual review of developments in Germany that he sent the War Office in London the theatrical unveiling of 15 years of secret planning. Thorne had seized every opportunity to corner senior German officers and witness their new tactics, and had perceptibly recognized clues about, quote, the size of mobile forces and the emphasis on mechanical traction. Although Thorne was still unable to put a name on it, he identified the German General Staff's seismic master plan for future war and victory, the Blitzkrieg. In their bid to revolutionize warfare, the German military had conspired with scientists, engineers, and industrialists to produce weapons that would render all previous tactics obsolete. Deverell and his staff at the War Office were puzzled by Thorne's report. Their thinking was still dominated by the memories of the trenches and mud of the Somme. After all, the lance had been withdrawn as a standard British battlefield weapon within living memory, and for them the horse was still the archetypal, quote, fast-moving vehicle, unquote, on the battlefield. The next war, they convinced themselves, would be fought in the colonies, not in Europe. Consequently, on the insistence of the commander-in-chief, India, the War Office, had just postponed replacing the shrapnel shell with the more effective high-explosive shell, whose advantages no one was sufficiently qualified to explain. Unprompted by a succession of masters of ordnance, the British General Staff simply did not understand that diligent tinkering with chemicals could produce more effective shells. The same critical lack of interest greeted Thorne's second, more substantial report, which asserted that, quote, evidence of the Reichswehr moving toward mechanization is strong, unquote, and that the German army would be battle ready in 1939. Ominously, while Foreign Office officials were clearly impressed by Thorne's wealth of information and authoritative analysis, his colleagues at the War Office remained skeptical. Colonel Elliot Hotblack, Thorne's successor, suffered a similar shock when, soon after his arrival in Berlin in 1936, he realized how crucially for future military successes would depend upon scientific innovation. The British Army, he wrote, quote, still compares favorably with the German in training and tactical ideas, but would appear to be at a very great disadvantage in the matter of equipment, since the German army is apparently backed by an organization which is prepared to make progressive use of any new developments. An important factor in these rapid improvements is that comprehensively large quantities of experimental equipment are produced and, after experience has been gained, are rapidly replaced by improved material. Despite the emerging prospect of a new war in Europe, senior American and British officers still displayed a curious lack of interest in Germany's preparations for blitzkrieg tactics. For the most part, military intelligence in both London and Washington was still rigidly restricted to reports on troop movements and strategic intentions, and nobody had seriously considered the possibility of using the intelligence agencies to gather technical details of the weaponry that a potential enemy would employ. Isn't that remarkable? But they just weren't thinking of using the intelligence agencies. Which what did we have then? Well, the OSS was brand new, and it was pretty much British controlled. And this is just my comment. It appears to me that the reason that they weren't too interested in Hitler's coming blitzkrieg was because the British royals and the people really in the know at the top of the British food chain were expecting Britain to benefit from Hitler invading Russia, and they did not expect Britain at all to be a target of Hitler. As Captain Kenneth Strong of MI3, a War Office intelligence section, discovered after arriving in Berlin in 1937 as a British military attaché, the architects of the new Panzer divisions had found the ideal compromise between weight, engine size, armor, and gun. Strong, who had just embarked upon a prestigious career in military intelligence, was startled by Germany's combined strategic battle plan of a rapid tank advance that depended upon the Luftwaffe's swift destruction of the enemy air force and its communication network. But to his chagrin, the War Office ignored his reports of superior German performance over British weapons. Unlike his British and American counterparts, General Heinz Guderian, the German tank expert, had recognized that designing a tank was a complicated juggling act aimed at resolving glaring contradictions of speed, weight of armor, and size of gun. The ideal tank would be a fast-moving and well-protected vehicle bearing a powerful barrel. It also needed to be easily adapted to incorporate improvements and to match any technical advantages built into the enemy's tanks. But the design and construction of that ideal tank demanded a quality of intellectual agility that Strong knew was lacking among the traditionalists in London. Deverell's dismissal as chief of the Imperial General Staff later that year removed a major obstacle, but the Army still needed time to squeeze out of its technical and tactical straitjacket. After Strong's return to Britain, he discovered that even as late as 1941, his dispatches describing German plans to improve tank armor were still dismissed as absurd by the War Office's technical branch. The same branch also ignored his eyewitness reports from Wehrmacht maneuvers that the Germans were using the 88mm anti-aircraft gun as an unbeatable anti-tank weapon and had developed a single weapon, the MG-34, which could be used both as a heavy and light machine gun. Strong's only consolation was that the post-war attitude of the military establishment in Washington was, if anything, even more complacent and more conservative than that of the War Office. In January 1919, Brigadier General William Westervelt had led 7 officers to Europe to report on future artillery needs of the U.S. Army. His report, the product of 5 months' exhaustive research, described the ideal needs of a future mechanized army, yet the report was shelved. Although American technicians during World War I had successfully developed improved ammunition, delayed fuses, and bombs, 20 years later the U.S. General Staff seemed determined to equip its army with antiquated anti-tank guns and howitzers. The standard 75mm howitzer was designed to be packed on a mule. The 37 millimeter anti-tank gun was reported in 1935 by the U.S. military attaché in Berlin to be already outclassed by equivalent German and Russian guns, and the heavy 240 millimeter howitzer was totally unsuitable for any prospective battle. As in Britain, the legacy of World War I was stifling. General John Pershing, the hero of World War I, had insisted on his triumphal return from Europe that tanks should remain an infantry responsibility, deliberately forestalling the development of a separate tank strategy. To enshrine his decision, the National Defense Act passed in 1920 explicitly prohibited the recreation of an independent tank corps. With the prospect of war so remote, Pershing's diktat remained uncontradicted among the traditionalist, technically uneducated U.S. chiefs of staff. 2 years later, in granting very limited funds for tank development, the adjutant general laid down the basis for the grant. Quote, "The primary mission of the tank is to facilitate the uninterrupted advance of the riflemen in the attack." Unquote. Army appropriations for tank development averaged about $60,000 a year, just sufficient for one experimental model, and progress was barely at a snail's pace. 9 years later, when General Douglas MacArthur demanded a highly mechanized army, the tactical role of tanks in American strategy was unchanged. Confused by the lack of dialogue between designers and users and influenced by the British, the American Ordnance Board had developed only vulnerable light tanks and had rejected outright the T3 model, a pathfinder designed by America's tank pioneer J. Walter Christie. An idiosyncratic and distrusted entrepreneur, Christie had not succumbed to the fatal error of designing the tank and its gun in isolation from one another. Unlike U.S. ordnance, the Russians were interested and bought Christie's ideas, developing them to build the hugely successful T-34 tank. America's misfortune was compounded by the low caliber of their military attachés in Berlin. Lieutenant Colonel Jacob Wust, W-U-E-S-T, the attaché in 1933, possessed a markedly uninquiring personality, which apparently did not displease his superiors in Washington. Wust's reports contained no original material, but instead criticized articles by French and Belgian experts. Hitler's violations of the Versailles Treaty's limitations on weapons were, according to Wust, quote, "not particularly alarming, so that she is not an immediate menace to her neighbors," unquote. Over the next months, despite the general militarization enveloping the country, Wust sent only superficial technical details to Washington after perfunctory and unproductive visits to showcase munitions factories. Wust's replacement, Major Truman Smith, continued his predecessor's ritual. For weeks during the spring of 1936, Smith hesitated over whether to visit a major German tank factory, preferring at the last moment to withdraw because of fear that the Germans would insist on a reciprocal visit. Smith's self-denial meant his reports were sparse and contradictory. In contrast, Captain René Studler, the U.S. military attaché in London, traveled throughout Europe, sending more than 300 reports graphically describing the advanced technology of Germany's armaments industry. But Studler received little positive reaction in Washington, especially after Smith bitterly attacked the interloper. In 1937, Studler reported that Krupp, a leading German arms manufacturer, was developing a 47 millimeter or even 50 millimeter anti-tank gun to replace the standard 37 millimeter gun, but a contradictory endorsement written by Smith denying the possibility undermined Studler's credibility. The result was summarized by the official history. Quote, "Real or seeming lack of interest in the Ordnance Office in Washington tended to discourage the search for additional data. The testimony to a deep-seated complacency inimical to ideas not originating within the upper echelons of the Ordnance Department cannot be brushed aside," unquote. As a result, throughout the war, American troops were outgunned. Quote, "The Ordnance Department was by no means alone in its too frequent do-nothing attitude. admits the official history, quote, every branch and service of the U.S. Army, including the Air Corps, displayed it. In Britain, the Royal Navy, basking in the memory of its past glories, shared the Army's disdain for technical intelligence and its unwillingness to reassess tactics in the light of new developments, especially submarine warfare and the vulnerability of ships to air attack. The Admiralty was convinced that the Royal Navy had retained the advantages that it possessed during World War I. A series of seminars held by the Institution of Naval Architects in March 1921 had discussed a very limited post-war Admiralty investigation of German naval design and concluded that it was inferior to Britain's. The proof of the pudding, Vice Admiral Sir Frederick Tudor told his colleagues, is in the eating. Their ships are mostly at the bottom of the sea. Ours will, at any rate, for 1 or 2 more years, continue to guard the safety of this nation, unquote. At the same meeting, the threat of submarine warfare was roundly dismissed by the Admiralty's investigator, Sir Eustace D'Eyncourt, because the 3 ships that had been torpedoed, quote, got home safely to port, unquote. 13 years later, little had changed. Part of the blame rested on the dismantling of the Admiralty's intelligence organization after 1918. The skeleton that remained in the shape of the post of Director of Naval Intelligence was all but crushed by Foreign Office insistence that all future intelligence be channeled through Britain's Overseas Intelligence Agency, the SIS, despite its notorious unreliability. This generated jealousy and unbridgeable inter-service suspicion. The legendary power and influence enjoyed in Room 40 under Sir Reginald Blinker Hall disappeared, and the DNI was deliberately denied any prominence or resources by other sections of the naval staff. Naval intelligence amounted to little more than haphazard monitoring of the movements of foreign navies on the basis of port sightings around the world. After 1935, its activities modestly expanded following the appointment of Vice Admiral James Troup, T-R-O-U-P, as the Director of Naval Intelligence. Although Troup was condemned as, quote, an absolute child about intelligence, unquote, he at least reestablished the Operational Intelligence Center, a framework for analyzing every source of naval intelligence. Secret NID-7, however, which was responsible for technical intelligence, remained merely symbolic. NID-7's director, Captain John Charlie, notoriously distinguished himself by scornfully dismissing intelligence reports from British naval attachés in Germany that Admiral Erich Raeder's new fleet would far exceed the limitations set out in the Treaty of Versailles, and that the Bismarck was substantially bigger than officially conceded by the Germans. Charlie breezily surmised that Admiral Raeder would not deliberately lie. At the end of 1939, Charlie would also ignore a British agent's report from Uruguay that the Admiral Graf Spee's guns were guided by radar, then a new development. Charlie filed and forgot the report, but his status in the Admiralty was in any case so low that he had no authority to inquire within his own service whether any account was being taken of the German inventions. Hence, Charlie was not to blame when the Admiralty ignored attachés' reports that Admiral Raeder's strategic intention in a future war was to deploy a large fleet of submarines to enforce a blockade against any potential enemy. Despite the Chief of Naval Staff's own warning that it would be a dangerous illusion for us to infer that we have a reliable measure of what she can do, that's Germany, the Admiralty Board comforted itself with the expectation that any submarine menace would be swept aside by ASDIC, A-S-D-I-C, a new submarine detecting device based on a quartz crystal picking up underwater vibrations. Progress in anti-submarine measures, reported the Naval Intelligence Division in 1936, may have rendered submarine warfare less effective. Deluded about its own technical superiority, the Admiralty assumed that any naval war would be fought on the surface rather than beneath the waves, thus preventing any reassessment of its tactics for hunting down U-boats. ASDIC suffered from 3 major handicaps. It did not reveal the depth of the submarine, it could not detect a submarine on the surface, and it required highly trained operators. Eschewing new scientific tests, the Admiralty relied on a 1914 to 18 strategy of deploying a massive task force to comb the sea in the hope of finding its quarry. Supremely confident, the Admiralty chiefs briefed a minister on the eve of war to tell the House of Commons that, quote, the submarine menace has been mastered, unquote. 6 months later, HMS Courageous, a converted heavy cruiser, was plowing through the North Sea with its ASDIC searching for U-boats when it was struck by 2 German torpedoes. More than 500 seamen drowned, the first casualties of the Admiralty's conviction that it would be fighting the same war of heavy guns on enormous ships firing into the mist that Admiral John Jellicoe had won more than 20 years earlier. Scientific development in the Navy during the pre-war years was the responsibility of the 3rd Sea Lord, Rear Admiral Bruce Fraser. Fraser both epitomized and was the victim of the senior service's disdain for outsiders, especially technicians. Engineering was an unattractive career in a service where ambitious officers sought only to command a ship at sea. Directors of the research establishments changed with damaging regularity, frustrating long-term operational research. Without scientific assistance, Fraser's department ignored intelligence about a host of vital innovations and the intrinsic weakness of British designs. The atmosphere at the Admiralty was built on innumerable fallacies, none more perilous than the belief that if a ship's gun shot at an aircraft, the aircraft would continue to fly in a straight line, quote unquote. With steadfast self-confidence, the naval planners invariably discussed any German threat on the unspoken but agreed premise that only naval guns could sink naval ships. Admiral Sir Dudley Pound was shocked when an irate air chief quipped that even if a bomb was to fall on a ship, the Navy would nevertheless claim that the damage was caused by a mine. Bombing ships had been unquestionably disapproved of since 1925, when the Admiralty stipulated that naval aircraft would never carry bombs weighing more than 100 pounds. The Navy, Pound and his colleagues never ceased to boast, fought with ships, not with aircraft. Consequently, Coastal Command aircraft were not equipped with bomb sights, and depth charges were not adapted for use from aircraft. To protect the fleet from air attack in the late 1920s, the Admiralty had commissioned a tachymetric system, which required naval gunners to aim at aircraft using guesswork rather than accurate scientific measurements. In 1936, Lord Chatfield, the minister responsible for defense coordination, wrote to Churchill that he was confident of the British merchant fleet's invulnerability. Quote, because even one anti-aircraft gun in a merchant ship, unquote, would keep the aircraft at such a height that the chance of destruction was very small. Yet, in the same year, Admiral Sir John Fisher, the commander-in-chief of the Mediterranean Fleet, complained to the Navy that the Navy had no defense against the new German dive bombers. To resolve the dispute, a major exercise was held the following year, watched by an impressive collection of senior naval staff. A droning Queen Bee target flew a predictable course directly above the awesome guns of the home fleet. To the considerable discomfort of the onlookers, it serenely circled the Armada for 2.5 hours while the fleet unsuccessfully tried to shoot it down. After the fiasco, Chatfield admitted with characteristic British understatement that, quote, our present system is very imperfect, unquote. A menace to the service was how Charles Wright, the director of scientific research, described the Admiralty's disastrous anti-aircraft equipment. Both the Americans and, more sinisterly, the Germans were known to have perfected a more reliable system, but the Admiralty had disdainfully rejected an offer of American cooperation 2 years earlier. In reply to Wright's criticisms, the Navy's Ordnance Department vigorously defended its design, not least on the basis that British was always best. Yet the fault was fundamental. The gun designers had not even considered consulting scientists or technicians until their worthless system had been installed throughout the fleet. A full investigation was commissioned by the Committee of Imperial Defense. The brilliant and mercurial scientist Henry Tizard was co-opted onto the subcommittee on bombing and anti-aircraft gunfire experiments in the knowledge that his presence alone would be a safeguard against any attempt at a political cover-up. The committee's report in January 1939 was devastating. Quote, 2 hits on every aircraft carrier and 1 on every cruiser may be expected for every aircraft hit. Destroyers are virtually defenseless from air attack. It is difficult for us to avoid the conclusion that the protection of merchant shipping from air attack is at present unsolved. Until then, many believed that the fleet could be partially protected by catapult-launched aircraft, a proposal that had been successfully urged by Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, soon to become Admiral of the Fleet. Yet neither Pound nor any other naval chief had considered essential to the catapult's success was an effective autogyro, which had not been installed. For the generation of British sailors recruited to the service in the reign of Queen Victoria, the development of sophisticated technology was quite simply too puzzling. Unlike the Army and the Navy, theoretically the Royal Air Force should not have been strangled by historic complacency, but neither the service chiefs nor the politicians realized that the advance of aviation technology would render Britain's traditional defense, the English Channel, largely ineffectual. The officials at the Air Ministry, condemned by Reggie Fletcher, an SIS section director, as discards from the Army and Navy, were, quote, gentlemen administrators with little understanding of aviation technology. Until 1935, favored manufacturers, cosseted by Air Ministry officials, earned huge profits from government contracts but remained stubbornly reluctant to reinvest in research and development. The American attitude was completely different. Asked to prepare a mock-up for Sir Arthur Harris, Lockheed complied without a murmur within 24 hours of his request. In Britain, Harris complained it could not have been produced in less than months. Germany's dramatic announcement in 1935 of her intention to build a 4,000 airplane Luftwaffe propelled those responsible in London to embark on a competition for superior numbers rather than technical superiority. Anxious British service staff and officials, still suffering the legacy of Stanley Baldwin's doom-laden prophecy 3 years earlier that, quote, the bomber will always get through, unquote, began juggling a series of options for maximizing Britain's aircraft production, although ironically, Baldwin's prediction reassured the RAF that British bombers would, quote, always get through, too. Alarmed by Hitler's bellicose announcement of conscription in March 1935 and his boast that the Luftwaffe had reached parity with the RAF, Neville Chamberlain commissioned Britain's rearmament without either adequate intelligence about the technical performance of the Luftwaffe's aircraft or accurate specifications for Britain's own fighters and bombers. The fragmented British aviation industry had no fewer than 16 separate design teams, producing planes that, with notable exceptions, were underpowered, undergunned, and underranged. Rashly, Chamberlain bowed to his officials' insistence on ordering Battle, Blenheim, and Whitley bombers. Those are the names, I guess, of the bomber styles. Although all 3 types were known to be dangerously obsolescent. Sheer numbers were the only consideration. Meeting on May 10, 1935, the Ministerial Committee on Defense Requirements was presented with 2 wildly conflicting estimates of the Luftwaffe's potential size. While the Air Ministry suggested that the Germans had trained 4,000 pilots, the SIS stated that it was exactly double that number. Between 1934 and 39, the RAF would produce 12 reports on the German Air Force, all of them substantially inaccurate. In the absence of reliable intelligence, the Air Ministry assumed that the Germans, like the British, would need time to consolidate after building their first 1,500 aircraft. When the Germans reached their target in 1936 and unhesitatingly continued to expand, our Air Ministry officials in London were perplexed. Among the first to recognize the cost of Air Ministry attitudes was Air Chief Marshal Sir Edgar Ludlow Hewitt, who was appointed Commander-in-Chief Bomber Command in September 1937. A rapid introductory tour of duty convinced him of the frightening absence of any professionalism and technical efficiency among the airmen who would soon be dispatched over Germany. Quote, "The present situation is most disquieting," he noted on his return to London. The romantic notion of flying had blinded even the practitioners to the understanding that their success in battle depended upon the best aircraft, the best weapons, and the best instruments. To his horror, Ludlow Hewitt discovered that the RAF proposed to fly without adequate navigational aids, safety devices, or guns, and would attempt to deliver notoriously unreliable bombs using totally inaccurate bomb sights. Even after he had spotlighted the confusion and inefficiency among his ranks, Ludlow Hewitt remained a lone voice. According to the official history, quote, "When war came in 1939, Bomber Command was not trained or equipped either to penetrate into enemy territory by day or to find its targeted areas, let alone its targets, by night. In theory, the RAF should have been different from the other services. Every flight, even if not in combat, provided operational experience, and technically minded pilots should have been able to explain deficiencies and recommend improvements. Some did, but only a few men had the breadth of vision to recognize the Luftwaffe's true strength." Well, I can see that we have reached noon hour here on the East Coast, here at Mystery Island, and so I'm going to stop reading here on page 20. And just to give you encouragement about it, the story about the tanks and the airplanes will soon be set aside, and we will move on to the issue of chemical and biological warfare. I don't think I'll read the whole book, but I wanted to get at least knowledge of the book's existence before our research partners and research group, and note that as with many of the books on my shelf, I have gone painstakingly through the index to underline and notice important names and to be able to go back and reference to them, which really does help a lot if you're trying to research things across a number of books. So, anyway, I have a number of excerpts from this book that I want to bring to your attention, and I will do that the next time we open Tom Bauer's book, The Paperclip Conspiracy, The Hunt for the Nazi Scientists, published in 1987, long before Annie Jacobson's book on Operation Paperclip. I think we're going to learn a lot from this book, so let's stick with it. All right, I appreciate your being with me this morning, and we'll be diving more into that book, but also into all the other areas we research here at McDuff Lives. And I will speak to you again tomorrow about other issues such as health.